In the spring of 2003, two unmarked police cars rolled quietly through the streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a college town where most people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's children by name, where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. The cars stopped in front of a modest ranch home on Sycamore Street, and when the officers stepped out, they carried with them something the town hadn't seen in 26 years, an answer. But the answer would shake Cedar Falls in ways the original crime never could. Because the person they came to arrest that morning wasn't a stranger. Wasn't a drifter. Wasn't someone who'd blown through town and disappeared into the darkness. The person responsible for what happened to 16-year-old Michelle Hartley in October of 1977 had been there all along, living among them, shopping at the same grocery store, attending the same church picnics, breathing the same air. And when the handcuffs closed around those wrists that spring morning, the sound echoed backward through more than 2 decades of silence, grief, and a lie so carefully maintained that an entire community had built their peace around it. Before we continue with this story, with the terrible unraveling of everything Cedar Falls thought it knew, take a second to subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. October 15, 1977. A Saturday. The kind of autumn day in Cedar Falls when the air smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves, when high school football fills the Friday night memory and Sunday church service waits just around the corner. Michelle Hartley woke up that morning in the bedroom she'd had since childhood, the one with the yellow wallpaper her mother had hung when Michelle turned 13. She was 16 now, a junior at Cedar Falls High School, and if you'd asked anyone in town to describe her, they'd have used words like sweet, responsible, maybe a little quiet. She wasn't the girl who stood out in a crowd. She was the girl who worked her shift at the Dairy Queen without complaint, who helped her younger brother with his homework, who sang in the church choir even though her voice wasn't particularly strong. Ordinary. That's what people would say later, though they'd mean it kindly. Michelle Hartley was beautifully, perfectly ordinary. That Saturday morning, she told her mother she was meeting her friend Jenny at the library. They had a history project due Monday, something about the Civil War, her mother would remember later, though the specific details escaped her. Michelle left the house around 10:30. She was wearing jeans, a green sweater her grandmother had sent for her birthday, and her favorite sneakers, the white ones with the blue stripe she'd saved up 3 paychecks to buy. Her mother watched from the kitchen window as Michelle walked down the driveway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The image would replay in her mind for the rest of her life, Michelle turning at the end of the driveway, raising one hand in a casual wave, the morning sun catching the auburn in her hair. Michelle never made it to the library. When she wasn't home by dinner, her mother called Jenny's house. Jenny answered on the second ring, confused. They hadn't had plans to meet at the library. They'd finished the history project on Thursday. Michelle hadn't called her all day. The fear that gripped Mrs. Hartley in that moment wasn't rational yet. It was instinctive, the way your body knows before your mind catches up. She called her husband at his office. Called Michelle's other friends. Called the Dairy Queen, though Michelle wasn't scheduled to work. Each phone call tightened the knot in her chest, because with each one, the world where Michelle had simply lost track of time grew smaller. By 7 o'clock that evening, Cedar Falls police received the missing person report. Michelle Hartley, 16 years old, last seen leaving her home at approximately 10:30 that morning. The responding officer was sympathetic but not particularly concerned. Teenage girls ran off sometimes. Got into arguments with their parents and stayed overnight with friends. Went to parties they weren't supposed to attend. Michelle would probably turn up by morning with an embarrassed apology and a story that didn't quite add up. But Sunday morning came, and Michelle didn't. The search began in earnest on Sunday afternoon. Volunteers gathered in the parking lot of Cedar Falls High School, teachers, parents, students, people who'd never met Michelle but who understood that a missing girl was everyone's concern. They fanned out across the town in organized grids, checking parks, wooded areas, abandoned buildings, anywhere a teenage girl might hide or be hidden. The October light was already fading by the time someone suggested checking the old industrial area east of town, where the grain elevator loomed against the darkening sky. It was a farmer named Robert Clemens who found her. He'd volunteered for the search because his own daughter was Michelle's age, and he kept thinking about what he'd want others to do if it were her. The abandoned grain storage facility sat on property that hadn't been operational in 5 years, and most of the structures were locked up tight. But there was a small maintenance shed near the back of the property, its door slightly ajar. Later, Clemens would say he almost didn't check it. Something in his gut told him to look anyway. Michelle was inside. She'd been strangled. That's what the medical examiner would determine in the formal autopsy, though anyone who saw her knew it immediately from the bruising around her neck. She was still wearing the green sweater, the jeans, the white sneakers with the blue stripe. She'd been positioned carefully against the back wall of the shed, almost arranged, her hands folded across her stomach. There was no evidence of sexual assault. No signs of a prolonged struggle. Her backpack was missing, never to be recovered. The scene was processed with the resources available in 1977, photographs, fingerprint powder, careful documentation. But this was Cedar Falls, Iowa, not a major metropolitan area. The police department had 2 detectives. The medical examiner worked part-time and ran a private practice on the side. They did their best. Everyone did their best. The investigation that followed consumed the town. Detective Warren Pruitt led the case, a man who'd been with the Cedar Falls police for 18 years and had never worked a homicide. He approached it with methodical determination, interviewing everyone who knew Michelle, tracking her movements, trying to reconstruct those missing hours between when she left home and when she ended up in that shed. What they learned painted a picture of a life without obvious enemies. Michelle didn't have a boyfriend, wasn't involved in any conflicts at school, hadn't expressed fear of anyone. Her friend circle was small and stable. Her grades were decent. She worked her shifts at the Dairy Queen and saved most of her money. The most rebellious thing anyone could recall her doing was sneaking a cigarette behind the gym once, and she'd felt so guilty about it she'd confessed to her mother the same day. The lie about meeting Jenny at the library troubled Detective Pruitt. It suggested Michelle had plans she didn't want her parents to know about. But what plans? And with whom? He pressed Jenny during multiple interviews, asking if Michelle had mentioned meeting anyone, if there was a boy, if she'd seemed different in the days before she disappeared. Jenny insisted she knew nothing. Michelle hadn't said anything unusual. Hadn't acted strange. Hadn't mentioned any secret plans. There were tips, of course. In a town the size of Cedar Falls, everyone knew someone who might have seen something. A woman reported seeing a teenage girl matching Michelle's description getting into a blue sedan near the downtown area around noon that Saturday. Another witness claimed to have seen her walking alone on Highway 58, though the timing didn't align with the other sightings. A gas station attendant remembered a nervous-looking girl buying a Coke around 11, but couldn't say for certain it was Michelle. Detective Pruitt followed each lead with the same thorough attention. The blue sedan sighting seemed promising until they tracked down the vehicle. It belonged to a local insurance agent who'd picked up his niece that day, a girl who happened to have auburn hair and a similar build to Michelle. The Highway 58 sighting was likely a case of mistaken identity. The girl at the gas station could have been anyone. What the investigation needed was physical evidence, and there was frustratingly little. The shed where Michelle's body was found yielded dozens of fingerprints, but the building had been abandoned for years and accessed periodically by teenagers looking for a place to drink or make out. Sorting through which prints mattered and which were merely background noise proved nearly impossible with the technology available. There were no witnesses to the actual crime. No murder weapon to trace. No clear motive to follow. The autopsy provided clinical details but few answers. Michelle had died from asphyxiation due to strangulation, likely manual, meaning someone had used their hands, not a rope or ligature. The medical examiner estimated time of death between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. on Saturday, October 15. There were bruises on her upper arms consistent with being grabbed forcefully. A small cut on her left palm suggested she might have tried to defend herself, though it was minimal. The lack of sexual assault puzzled investigators. Most teenage girls murdered by strangers suffered sexual violence. The careful positioning of the body suggested someone who knew her, someone who felt remorse or at least wanted to show a degree of care even after taking her life. Weeks turned into months. The tips slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Detective Pruitt worked the case obsessively, filling notebooks with theories, connections, timelines that went nowhere. He interviewed Michelle's teachers again, her co-workers at the Dairy Queen, the families who lived near the grain facility. He drove the route from Michelle's house to the library dozens of times, trying to imagine where she might have gone instead, who she might have encountered. He kept returning to that lie. Michelle had told her mother she was going to the library to meet Jenny. But Jenny hadn't known anything about it. Which meant Michelle had somewhere else to be, someone else to meet. But who? And why the secrecy? Pruitt looked at the boys in Michelle's class, anyone who might have had an interest in her. There was a junior named Scott Henderson who'd asked her to homecoming the previous year. She'd said no, but they'd remained friendly. Pruitt interviewed him 3 times. Scott had been at home that Saturday, watching college football with his father. The alibi checked out. There was another boy, Tommy Vickers, who worked the counter at the Dairy Queen with Michelle. He'd had a crush on her that was obvious to everyone. But Tommy had been working a double shift that Saturday, clocked in at 9 a.m., didn't leave until 6 p.m. The manager confirmed it. The time cards confirmed it. Pruitt expanded his search. He looked at adult men who'd had contact with Michelle. The mailman who delivered to Sycamore Street. The youth pastor at First Lutheran. The mechanic who'd fixed the Hartley family car the previous month. He found nothing suspicious, no red flags, no reason to believe any of them had been involved. The investigation was thorough, exhaustive, and ultimately fruitless. By the time 1978 arrived, Pruitt had interviewed over 200 people, followed up on more than 100 tips, and was no closer to knowing who killed Michelle Hartley than he'd been the day her body was found. The town of Cedar Falls processed its grief publicly at first. There was a memorial service at First Lutheran Church that packed the building beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the front lawn. Michelle's mother sobbed quietly in the front pew, her husband's arm around her shoulders, while the pastor spoke about innocence lost and faith tested. Michelle's younger brother sat rigid and silent, staring at the closed casket like it might open if he looked hard enough. The high school planted a tree in Michelle's honor, a young oak on the east side of campus. Her locker became an informal shrine for weeks, covered in notes and flowers and photographs until the administration gently asked that the items be moved. But public grief has a shelf life. By the time winter arrived, Cedar Falls had returned to its routines. People stopped talking about Michelle Hartley quite so much. The investigation remained open, but Detective Pruitt had other cases demanding his attention: burglaries, domestic incidents, the occasional drunk driver. Michelle's file sat on his desk, growing thicker but no closer to resolution. The Hartley family never recovered in any meaningful sense. How could they? Their daughter left for the library one Saturday morning and came home in a coffin. Mrs. Hartley stopped working her part-time job at the elementary school. She couldn't bear being around children Michelle's age, watching them grow up, graduate, go to college, get married, all the things Michelle would never do. Mr. Hartley threw himself into his work, spending longer hours at the insurance office, taking on clients in neighboring towns, anything to avoid sitting in the house where Michelle's absence echoed in every room. Michelle's brother, Danny, was 13 when she died. He grew up in the shadow of his sister's murder, the kid whose family was touched by tragedy, the one people looked at with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable curiosity. He stopped bringing friends home because he didn't know how to explain the bedroom his mother kept pristine, the way conversations would stop when Michelle's name came up, the heaviness that settled over the house like fog. At school, Danny became known as the quiet one. Teachers gave him sympathetic looks and didn't push too hard when his grades slipped. Classmates whispered about him in hallways, creating legends around his tragedy. Some said he'd found the body himself. Others claimed he'd seen the killer. None of it was true, but Danny learned early that people preferred their stories to the truth. He left Cedar Falls the day after his high school graduation in 1982 and rarely came back, building a life in Denver where no one knew his history unless he chose to share it. Which he never did. The years passed with a strange, cruel steadiness. 1978 became 1979 became 1980. The grain facility where Michelle's body was found sat abandoned, becoming the subject of local ghost stories. Teenagers dared each other to go there at night. Some claimed to have seen Michelle's spirit wandering near the shed. Others said they'd heard crying. It was the way small towns processed trauma they couldn't solve, turned it into folklore, made it something other than the brutal reality of an unsolved murder. Detective Pruitt retired in 1985, handing Michelle's file over to a younger detective named Susan Martinez with the quiet admission that he'd failed. He'd worked the case as hard as he knew how, and it hadn't been enough. On his last day at the department, he drove out to the grain facility and stood where Michelle's body had been found. He apologized to her, there in the empty shed, for not being able to give her justice. Then he went home and tried to forget, which of course he couldn't. Martinez reviewed the file periodically, but there was nowhere new to go with it. The physical evidence had been processed. The witnesses had been interviewed multiple times. The leads had been exhausted. She added Michelle's case to the growing stack of cold files in the evidence room, cases that would probably never be solved, families that would probably never get answers. Cedar Falls changed the way small towns do, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The Dairy Queen where Michelle worked closed in 1989 and became a video rental store. The grain facility where her body was found was demolished in 1992 and turned into a small industrial park. First Lutheran Church underwent renovations that moved the memorial plaque honoring Michelle to a less prominent location. The oak tree planted in her memory grew tall and strong, though fewer people remembered why it was there. New families moved to Cedar Falls. Young couples buying their first homes, drawn by good schools and low crime rates. They knew nothing about Michelle Hartley. To them, Cedar Falls was just a safe, quiet place to raise children. The murder from 1977 wasn't part of their narrative of the town. But in certain corners of the town, among certain people, the case never really went cold. Mrs. Hartley called the police department once a month, every month, for 26 years. Same question, any news? Any progress? Anything at all? The answer was always no, delivered with increasing gentleness as the years accumulated. The officers who took her calls changed as retirements and transfers shuffled personnel, but Mrs. Hartley remained constant. First of the month, every month, without fail. She kept Michelle's bedroom exactly as it had been, the yellow wallpaper, the bed with its floral comforter, the desk where Michelle had done her homework. She changed the sheets once a week, dusted the furniture, vacuumed the carpet, kept the room ready as if Michelle might walk through the door at any moment. Mr. Hartley tried once, in 1983, to suggest they convert the room into something else. Maybe a home office. Maybe a guest room. His wife looked at him with such devastation in her eyes that he never mentioned it again. The toll this took on their marriage was silent but substantial. They stopped talking about Michelle because it hurt too much. They stopped talking about much of anything, really. They existed in parallel, sharing a house and a history but not much else. When Mr. Hartley had his stroke in 1999, Mrs. Hartley cared for him dutifully, but there was a distance between them that had calcified over decades of shared grief. Detective Martinez never stopped thinking about the case either, though she couldn't give it the attention Pruitt had. She had other murders to solve, other families waiting for justice. Cedar Falls wasn't the sleepy town it had been in 1977, drug crimes had increased, domestic violence cases took up more and more of her time, and the department was perpetually understaffed. But something about Michelle Hartley stayed with her. Maybe it was the ordinariness of it, a good kid, a Saturday morning, a simple lie about going to the library. Maybe it was the lack of obvious motive, the careful positioning of the body, the missing backpack that suggested someone had taken a trophy or removed evidence. Maybe it was just the accumulation of years without answers, the weight of unsolved death. In 1995, Martinez pulled the file again. New forensic techniques were emerging, DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated, more accessible to smaller departments. She sent the evidence to the state crime lab with a request for analysis, the clothing Michelle had been wearing, fingernail clippings taken during autopsy, any trace evidence that might yield results impossible to obtain in 1977. She waited 3 months for the results. When they came back, her hope deflated like a punctured tire. The samples showed degradation after nearly 2 decades. There were multiple DNA profiles from the shed where Michelle's body had been found, but nothing that could be definitively linked to the killer. The fingernail clippings contained only Michelle's own DNA. The clothing fibers matched nothing in any database. Martinez filed the report with the other documents and returned the box to the evidence room, feeling the familiar weight of failure. Arrived with all its millennial fanfare and apocalyptic predictions that amounted to nothing. Cedar Falls celebrated like every other small town in America: fireworks, parties, relief that the computers hadn't crashed and the world hadn't ended. Michelle Hartley had been dead for 23 years. Her mother was 62 years old. Her father had suffered his stroke and walked with a cane. Her brother had married and had a daughter he named Sarah, not Michelle. He couldn't bear to say his sister's name every day. Detective Martinez was approaching retirement herself. She'd solved 17 homicides during her career with the Cedar Falls police, a number that made her something of an anomaly in a town where murder was supposed to be rare. But the one that haunted her was the one she couldn't solve. She would dream about Michelle sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where Michelle would appear and ask, quietly, why no one was looking for her anymore. Martinez would wake up with the dream clinging to her, the image of a 16-year-old girl in a green sweater asking questions that had no good answers. In the spring of 2002, Martinez attended a conference on cold case investigations in Des Moines. The seminar covered new approaches to old cases, emphasizing the importance of re-interviewing witnesses as they aged, as their circumstances changed, as their loyalties shifted. People who wouldn't talk in 1977 might be willing to talk in 2002. Relationships that seemed unshakable might have deteriorated. Secrets that seemed worth keeping might lose their power over time. The presenter, a detective from Chicago who'd solved a 30-year-old murder, said something that stuck with Martinez: time doesn't just degrade evidence. It also degrades lies. People get tired of carrying secrets. They get old, they get sick, they start thinking about their legacy. That's when they talk. She returned to Cedar Falls with renewed purpose and pulled Michelle's file for what felt like the 100th time. She made a list of everyone interviewed in the original investigation who was still alive and still local. It was a shorter list than she expected. 25 years had taken their toll, people had moved away, passed away, simply away. But there were still names worth revisiting. She started with Michelle's friends from high school. Jenny Morrison, who'd been Jenny Caldwell back then, now worked as a dental hygienist and had 3 kids. She sat across from Martinez in the same interview room where Pruitt had questioned her in 1977 and said the same things she'd said then. Michelle hadn't mentioned any plans, hadn't seemed upset, hadn't said anything unusual in the days before she died. But Martinez pressed harder this time. Think back to the weeks before Michelle died. Did she seem distracted? Excited? Secretive? Jenny thought about it, really thought, her eyes distant. Maybe a little distracted. But we were 16. We were always distracted. Boys, grades, what we were going to wear to the homecoming dance. Did Michelle ever mention any of her teachers? Anyone she particularly liked or felt comfortable with? She liked Mr. Patterson, her biology teacher. And there was a substitute, I can't remember his name, who taught her English class a few times. She said he was nice. That he actually listened when students talked. Martinez made a note. This substitute teacher. Did Michelle ever mention him outside of class? I don't think so. Why? Just trying to build a complete picture. She interviewed Michelle's co-workers from the Dairy Queen, the ones still in town. A man named Greg Hoffman who'd worked the grill remembered Michelle as quiet, punctual, generally unremarkable. He'd been questioned extensively in 1977 because he'd asked Michelle out once and she'd turned him down, but he'd had an alibi for the day she disappeared. He'd been at a wedding in Iowa City with 30 witnesses. She interviewed the neighbors who'd lived on Sycamore Street in 1977, the ones who'd watched Michelle grow up. They repeated what they'd told Pruitt. Michelle seemed like a good kid, the family seemed normal, there was nothing unusual about that Saturday morning. Martinez was methodical, patient, but also increasingly frustrated. 25 years had passed, and people's memories hadn't improved. they'd calcified into simplified versions of events, the nuance and detail worn away by time. She was about to give up on the re-interview strategy when she remembered something from Pruitt's notes. In the original investigation, Pruitt had interviewed all the teachers and staff at Cedar Falls High School. Among them was a substitute teacher named Thomas Riley. The interview had been cursory, just a few questions about whether he'd noticed anything unusual about Michelle, whether they'd had any interactions outside of class. Riley had said no to both questions. Pruitt had checked off the box and moved on. Martinez decided to track down Riley and speak with him again. Not because she suspected him. After 25 years, she didn't really suspect anyone specifically anymore. But because she was being thorough, completing the circle of re-interviews. Thomas Riley had been 24 years old in 1977, a recent college graduate working as a substitute teacher at Cedar Falls High School. He'd taught Michelle's English class a handful of times when her regular teacher was out sick. Now, in 2002, he was 49 years old. He'd left teaching after a few years and gone into real estate, where he'd built a moderately successful career. He'd married in 1983, had 2 sons, divorced in 1997. He lived alone in a condo on the north side of Cedar Falls, attended Rotary Club meetings, coached youth baseball in the summers. He was, by all appearances, an upstanding citizen. Martinez called him on a Tuesday afternoon and asked if he'd be willing to answer a few follow-up questions about Michelle Hartley. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Riley's voice, "Of course, anything to help." They met at the police station on Thursday. Riley arrived punctual and polite, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt like he was heading to a business meeting. He shook Martinez's hand, accepted her offer of coffee, settled into the interview room chair with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. Martinez started with the same questions Pruitt had asked 25 years earlier. When had he last seen Michelle? Did he remember anything unusual about her behavior? Had she mentioned any problems, any concerns, anyone bothering her? Riley's answers matched the original interview almost word for word. He'd last seen Michelle in class, probably 2 weeks before her death, though he couldn't be certain of the exact date. She'd seemed like a normal student, quiet, attentive, not particularly memorable. No, she hadn't mentioned any problems. No, no one had been bothering her that he was aware of. Martinez let him talk, watching his body language, listening to the rhythm of his speech. He was calm, controlled, sitting with his hands folded on the table. He made eye contact when speaking but not excessively. He didn't fidget, didn't touch his face, didn't display any of the obvious signs of deception that interrogators were trained to look for. Then Martinez asked a question that hadn't been in the original interview: "Did you ever see Michelle outside of school?" The pause was barely noticeable. A beat, maybe 2. Then Riley smiled slightly and shook his head. "No, I don't think so. Cedar Falls is a small town, so I probably saw her around, at the grocery store or something, but I don't specifically remember." "The grocery store," Martinez repeated neutrally. "Or wherever. Like I said, small town. You see your students around." Martinez nodded, made a note, then shifted topics. They talked about Riley's time as a substitute teacher, his decision to leave education, his current work in real estate. The conversation was pleasant, unremarkable. After 40 minutes, Martinez thanked him for his time. But something nagged at her. Something about that pause, that careful answer about seeing Michelle outside of school. It wasn't suspicious exactly. Just careful. As if he'd thought about the question before answering, had selected his words deliberately. She returned to her office and pulled the original case file again, going through every witness statement, every interview note, every scrap of documentation with fresh eyes. And that's when she found it. Buried in a stack of witness statements from the initial investigation was a brief report from a woman named Carol Jennings. She'd been 26 in 1977, working at the public library. She'd been interviewed because police were checking whether Michelle had actually gone to the library that Saturday, despite Jenny's statement that they'd had no plans to meet. Carol Jennings had confirmed that Michelle hadn't come to the library that day. But there was one additional line in her statement, so inconsequential that Pruitt had apparently overlooked it: I did see her downtown that morning, though, around 11. She was walking with that substitute teacher who works at the high school sometimes. I can't remember his name. Martinez felt her pulse quicken. She checked the date of Carol Jennings's interview, October 18, 1977, 3 days after Michelle's body was found. Then she cross-referenced it with Thomas Riley's interview, October 22, 1977, 4 days after Jennings mentioned seeing Michelle with a substitute teacher. Had Pruitt made the connection? Had he asked Riley about it? Martinez searched through the interview notes again. There was no mention of Riley being seen with Michelle downtown. No follow-up questions about encountering her that Saturday morning. It could have been an oversight. Pruitt had been juggling dozens of witness statements, hundreds of pieces of information. In 1977, they didn't have computer databases to cross-reference information. Everything was done manually, with index cards and handwritten notes and human memory. A detail like this could easily slip through the cracks. Or Pruitt might have asked Riley about it off the record and gotten an innocent explanation that didn't warrant documentation. Or Carol Jennings might have been mistaken about what she saw, and Pruitt had dismissed it. But it was something. After 25 years of nothing, it was something. Martinez tracked down Carol Jennings, now Carol Thompson, living in Waterloo. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between their towns. She was 61 years old, a retired librarian with grandchildren and a gentle manner that made Martinez think she'd be a good witness, calm, thoughtful, not prone to exaggeration. I remember making that statement, Carol said, stirring sugar into her coffee. The police were asking everyone if they'd seen Michelle that Saturday, and I told them I hadn't seen her at the library, but I had seen her downtown. You said she was with a substitute teacher. Right. I recognized him because he'd come into the library a few times to check out books. I didn't know his name, but I knew he taught at the high school. Young guy, mid-20s maybe. Dark hair. Did they seem to be together, or did you just see them near each other? Carol thought about this, her brow furrowed. They were walking together. Side by side. They weren't holding hands or anything like that, but it was clear they were together, if that makes sense. Like they were having a conversation. Did Michelle seem upset? Uncomfortable? No, not that I noticed. But I only saw them for a few seconds. I was on the other side of the street, heading to the post office. I remember because I had a package to mail to my sister in California. Did you ever hear back from the police about that statement? No. I assumed it wasn't important. There were so many people being interviewed, so much information. I figured if they needed to follow up, they would. And you're certain about the date? It was definitely that Saturday? Yes. I remember because the next day was when they found her body, and I felt sick thinking I might have been one of the last people to see her alive. Martinez drove back to Cedar Falls with her mind racing. There was an innocent explanation, surely. Maybe Riley had run into Michelle by chance, walked with her for a block or two, said hello and moved on. Maybe he'd forgotten about it entirely by the time Pruitt interviewed him 4 days later. Maybe Carol had been mistaken about the date or the person she'd seen. But Riley had lied, or at the very least had been deceptive, when Martinez asked if he'd ever seen Michelle outside of school. He'd said he probably saw her around town but didn't specifically remember. He'd had the chance to mention that Saturday morning encounter, and he hadn't. Martinez knew she needed more before approaching Riley again. One witness statement from 25 years ago wasn't enough. She needed corroboration, context, something that would explain why a 24-year-old substitute teacher was walking downtown with a 16-year-old student on the morning she disappeared. She went back through Michelle's possessions, the boxes of personal effects that had been catalogued and stored after the investigation. There were the things you'd expect from a 16-year-old girl in 1977, diaries, schoolwork, letters from friends, photographs, ticket stubs, a collection of records, Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles, Carole King. Martinez had reviewed these items before, looking for anything that might indicate Michelle was involved with someone, afraid of someone, hiding something from her parents. She looked again with fresh eyes, specifically searching for any mention of Thomas Riley. Michelle's diary was a slim volume with a floral cover, its entries sporadic and often mundane. She wrote about homework assignments, arguments with her mother about curfew, which boys at school were cute, particularly a senior named Brad who she thought looked like Robert Redford, whether she should get her hair cut. The entries were innocent, sweet, the thoughts of a normal teenage girl navigating the ordinary challenges of high school life. But in an entry from September 1977, Martinez found something that made her sit up straighter. Mr. Riley is so much nicer than Mrs. Patterson. He actually listens when we talk about the books instead of just lecturing at us. He said my essay on To Kill a Mockingbird was one of the best he's read. It made me feel smart. 3 weeks later, another entry. Saw Mr. Riley at the library today. He helped me find books for my history project. He's really easy to talk to. I wish he was my regular teacher instead of just a substitute. And then, just 5 days before Michelle disappeared, Mr. Riley said I should think about taking AP English next year. He thinks I'm smart enough for it. I don't know if I am, but it was nice of him to say. He asked if I'd thought about college and what I might want to study. I told him maybe teaching, like him. He said I'd be good at it. The entries were innocent on their surface. A student appreciating a kind teacher, nothing more. But Martinez had worked enough cases to know that predators often groomed their victims with exactly this kind of attention, compliments, encouragement, making the young person feel special and understood. Making them feel like the adult truly saw them in a way their peers didn't. She kept reading. The final entry in Michelle's diary was dated October 13, 1977, 2 days before she disappeared. I'm meeting Mr. Riley on Saturday to talk about books and college. He said he'd give me advice about what schools have good English programs. I didn't tell Mom because she'd make it weird. It's not weird. He's just being nice. He really thinks I could get into a good school if I work hard. It's nice to have someone believe in me like that. Martinez sat back in her chair, the diary open on her desk. There it was. The reason Michelle had lied about going to the library. She'd had plans to meet Thomas Riley, and she'd known her mother wouldn't approve. The meeting itself wasn't necessarily sinister. Teachers met with students to discuss college plans, to provide mentorship, to offer guidance. But the secrecy troubled Martinez. Michelle had felt the need to hide the meeting from her mother, which suggested some awareness, however vague, that it crossed a boundary, even if she couldn't articulate why. And Riley had never mentioned any of this to Detective Pruitt. Not the encounters at the library, not the conversations about college, not the planned meeting on October 15th. He'd presented himself as barely knowing Michelle, as a substitute who'd filled in her English class a few times and had no meaningful interaction with her. That was a lie. And it was a lie about the specific day Michelle disappeared. As you're listening to this, I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comment. Martinez needed to be careful. 25 years had passed. Memories were unreliable. And a diary entry about a planned meeting didn't prove that meeting had actually occurred, much less that it had ended in murder. She needed more evidence, more context, more leverage before confronting Riley with what she'd found. She started looking into Riley's background more thoroughly. His employment records, his marriage and divorce, any criminal history. She requested his personnel file from the school district, citing the cold case investigation. What she found was interesting. Riley had worked as a substitute teacher from 1976 to 1979, then had left education entirely for a career in real estate. His personnel file contained no formal complaints, no disciplinary actions, but there was a note from the principal dated May 1978, Mr. Riley has informed us he will not be returning as a substitute teacher next year. We appreciate his service to our students. The phrasing was odd. Formal, careful, the kind of language administrators used when they wanted to document something without saying it directly. Martinez had seen this pattern before, institutional language designed to protect the institution as much as document the truth. She called the former principal, a man now in his 80s and living in a nursing home in Des Moines. His memory was shaky, fragmented by age and what might have been early dementia, but when she mentioned Thomas Riley, there was a flicker of recognition. There was something, the old man said slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. I can't remember exactly. A parent complaint, maybe? Or one of the other teachers mentioned something. It was handled quietly. We didn't want to make a scandal if it was nothing. What kind of complaint? Something about inappropriate attention to female students? I honestly can't remember the details. It's been so long. But I remember thinking it was probably nothing, just him being friendly, trying to connect with the kids. You know how it is, young teacher, enthusiastic, maybe doesn't realize how his attention might be interpreted. But better safe than sorry. So when he said he was leaving education to try real estate, I didn't try to talk him out of it. Seemed like a natural transition. Do you remember which parent complained? No, I'm sorry. It might not have even been a formal complaint. It might have just been concern. Someone mentioning something in passing. We took it seriously enough to make a note, but not seriously enough to involve the school board or anything like that. Martinez hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her office. Inappropriate attention to female students. Handled quietly. No formal documentation. Just a vague note in a personnel file and a convenient exit from teaching. How many times had this story played out? How many predators had slipped away because confronting them was uncomfortable, because people wanted to believe the best, because making it a formal matter meant acknowledging something ugly was happening in their school, their town, their community. She thought about Michelle Hartley, 16 years old, excited that a teacher thought she was smart, that someone was paying attention to her, offering to help her think about her future. Meeting him in secret because her mother would make it weird, because she didn't fully understand why an adult man wanting to spend time alone with her might be inappropriate. Martinez knew she needed to approach this carefully. She had a diary entry and a witness statement from 25 years ago. She had a vague recollection from a retired principal about a complaint that was never formally filed. She had Riley's lie about not seeing Michelle outside of school. None of this would hold up in court. But it was enough to have another conversation with Thomas Riley. She called him on a Monday morning in January 2003. The same polite tone, the same request, just a few more follow-up questions. Would he mind coming in again? Riley agreed immediately, that same cooperative manner. But this time, when he walked into the interview room, Martinez noticed something different. A tightness around his eyes. A stiffness in his posture. He was still polite, still agreeable, but there was a wariness that hadn't been there before. This time, Martinez didn't start gently. When Riley sat down across from her, she slid a copy of Carol Jennings's witness statement across the table without preamble. I found something interesting in the original case file, she said, her voice neutral. A librarian who saw you walking with Michelle Hartley downtown on the morning she disappeared. Do you remember that? Riley's face didn't change dramatically, but something shifted in his eyes. The ease, the confidence, it flickered. I don't know what you're talking about. Carol Jennings. She was working at the library in 1977. She saw you and Michelle together that Saturday morning, around 11 o'clock. Walking downtown together, having a conversation. She must be mistaken. I told Detective Pruitt I hadn't seen Michelle outside of school. I told you the same thing last time we spoke. Martinez nodded slowly. You did tell us that. But we also found Michelle's diary. She didn't mention that she'd only recently reviewed it thoroughly, let him think they'd had this information all along. She wrote about running into you at the library. About you helping her with a history project. About how you said she should take AP English because you thought she was smart enough. Riley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Okay, so I talked to her a few times. I was her teacher. I talked to a lot of students. I don't see what that has to do with anything. She also wrote that she was meeting you on Saturday, October 15th, to talk about college. The day she disappeared. The silence in the room was absolute. Martinez watched Riley's face, saw him calculating, deciding how to respond. The seconds stretched out, and in that silence, Martinez could almost hear him constructing his answer. That didn't happen, he said finally, his voice firm. Maybe she wrote that she wanted to meet me, but we never had any actual plans. I didn't see her that day. I was home. I've always said I was home that day. But Carol Jennings did see you with her that day. Downtown. Around the time Michelle left her house. Then she's wrong. It's been 25 years. She's confused about what she saw, or when she saw it, or who she saw. Memory is unreliable. You know that. Martinez leaned forward slightly. Here's what I think happened, Mr. Riley. I think Michelle met you that Saturday morning, just like she wrote in her diary. I think you were seen together downtown by Carol Jennings. And I think something went wrong. Maybe you made a pass at her and she rejected you. Maybe she threatened to tell someone about your inappropriate relationship with her. Maybe things got physical. Maybe it was an accident, you grabbed her to stop her from leaving or from making a scene, she fought back, things escalated. This is insane. Riley's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composure. You're accusing me of murder based on what? A diary entry from a 16-year-old girl and some woman who thinks she saw me 25 years ago? This is insane. I'm not accusing you of anything yet. I'm asking you to tell me the truth about what happened that day. The truth is I had nothing to do with Michelle Hartley's death. I barely knew her. I was a substitute teacher who filled in a few times in her class. That's it. I talked to her a couple times at the library because I ran into her and I was being friendly. That's what teachers do. We're friendly to our students. It doesn't mean anything sinister. Then why didn't you mention any of this to Detective Pruitt in 1977? Why did you say you had no interactions with Michelle outside of school when that clearly wasn't true? Riley's hands, which had been folded calmly on the table, twitched slightly. Because I was 24 years old and a girl I'd taught had just been murdered. I was scared. I didn't want to be involved. I thought if I said I knew her beyond the classroom, you'd think I had something to do with it. So I downplayed our interactions. That was stupid, maybe, but it wasn't criminal. Martinez let the silence stretch again. Then she said, quietly, we can test that, you know. DNA technology has come a long way since 1977. We have evidence from the crime scene. Clothing fibers. Trace evidence. If you were never alone with Michelle, if you never touched her, your DNA won't be there. It was a bluff, mostly. The evidence from 1977 had been tested in 1995 and had yielded nothing useful. But Riley didn't know that for certain. And Martinez watched his face carefully, looking for the tell. And there it was, a flash of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Or calculation. The look of someone trying to figure out how much the police actually knew versus how much they were guessing. I want a lawyer, Riley said, his voice flat. The conversation ended there. Riley left the police station with his lawyer's phone number already dialed. Martinez sat in the interview room for a long time after he left, reviewing what had just happened. Requesting a lawyer wasn't an admission of guilt. It was the smart thing to do when being questioned by police about a serious crime, and anyone who watched television knew that. But the shift in Riley's demeanor had been telling. The cooperative witness had become defensive, guarded, had refused to answer further questions. Martinez spent the next 3 months building her case. She re-interviewed everyone who'd known Riley in 1977, looking for patterns of inappropriate behavior with female students. She found them, though nothing that had ever been formally reported or documented. A former student named Patricia Brennan, now in her 40s and living in Chicago, remembered Riley from when she was 15. He used to compliment my appearance a lot, she said over the phone. Tell me I looked nice, that my hair looked pretty. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to say that. I thought maybe I was being oversensitive. He was just being nice, right? That's what I told myself. Another woman, Jennifer Marks, had been a senior when Riley was substituting. He offered to give me a ride home from school once. Said it was on his way. I declined because something felt off about it. I couldn't have told you what, exactly. Just a feeling. After Michelle Hartley was killed, I remembered that and wondered if I'd had a lucky escape. A teacher who'd worked at the high school in the late 70s, now retired in Florida, recalled thinking it odd how much time Riley spent talking to certain female students during his lunch break or between classes. Nothing overtly inappropriate, she said. But it struck me as unusually attentive. Most substitute teachers just do their job and leave. He seemed to linger, to seek out opportunities to talk to the girls. I mentioned it to the principal once, but he said he'd keep an eye on it and that was the end of it. Nothing concrete. Nothing actionable at the time. Just a pattern of boundary crossing, of a young man in a position of authority who paid particular attention to teenage girls in ways that made some of them uncomfortable. Martinez also looked at Riley's whereabouts on October 15, 1977. In his original interview with Pruitt, Riley had said he'd been home alone that Saturday morning, reading and doing yard work. No alibi. No witnesses. Just his word. And now, 25 years later, there was no way to verify or disprove that claim. The case went to the county prosecutor in March 2003. The prosecutor, a careful man named David Chen, reviewed the evidence Martinez had compiled and sighed. "It's all circumstantial," he said, tapping the folder on his desk. "The diary says she planned to meet him, but it doesn't prove she actually did. The witness saw them together, but it was 25 years ago and she only glimpsed them for a few seconds. The DNA evidence is inconclusive because the samples degraded. And we have no direct physical link to the crime scene." He lied, Martinez insisted, leaning forward in her chair. In the original investigation, he said he barely knew her, never saw her outside of school. We know that's not true. We have multiple diary entries about encounters at the library, conversations about her future. And Carol Jennings saw them together the morning Michelle disappeared. Lying to police isn't the same as murder. And his lawyer will argue that he downplayed his contact with Michelle because he was afraid of being misunderstood, not because he was guilty. A 24-year-old teacher, a murdered student, he panicked and minimized the relationship. That's not a crime. So we do nothing? Chen tapped his pen against the file, thinking. We can bring him in for additional questioning. Really press him. Sometimes people crack under sustained interrogation, especially if they've been carrying guilt for 25 years. The weight of that kind of secret, it can become unbearable. But Riley didn't crack. Through his lawyer, he agreed to one more interview, and he sat across from Martinez for 3 hours while she walked him through every inconsistency, every lie, every piece of evidence that pointed to his involvement in Michelle's death. He stuck to his story. He'd had minimal contact with Michelle beyond the classroom. Any encounters at the library had been brief, coincidental, the kind of casual interaction teachers have with students in a small town. He'd never been alone with her in any meaningful way. He hadn't seen her the day she disappeared. Carol Jennings was mistaken about what she'd seen or when she'd seen it. Michelle's diary was the fantasy of a teenage girl with a crush on her teacher, sad, yes, but not evidence of any actual relationship or planned meeting. He had nothing to do with her death. The interview ended with no confession, no breakthrough, no smoking gun. But Martinez wouldn't let it go. She kept investigating, kept looking for the one piece of evidence that would be enough to charge him. She interviewed Riley's ex-wife, asking if he'd ever mentioned Michelle Hartley, if he'd seemed different in the months after the murder, if there'd been anything unusual about his behavior. The ex-wife, a tired-looking woman named Sharon who'd remarried and moved to Minnesota, remembered nothing unusual. I didn't even meet Tom until 1981, she said. We were married for 16 years, and he never once mentioned that girl. I didn't know he'd been questioned about it until after his arrest. He kept a lot to himself. Martinez checked to see if Riley had left town around the time of the murder, if he'd taken any sudden trips, if his behavior had changed in observable ways. He hadn't. He'd continued working as a substitute teacher for another year and a half, living in the same apartment on Elm Street, going about his life as if nothing had happened. Unless you knew what you were looking for, there was nothing to see. Just a young man who'd eventually left teaching for real estate, who'd gotten married and divorced, who'd built a quiet, unremarkable life in the same town where a girl he'd once taught had been murdered. There was no sudden wealth that might suggest blackmail. No move to another state to escape suspicion. No pattern of similar crimes elsewhere that might establish him as a serial offender. It was the perfect crime, in a way. Not perfect because of brilliant planning, but perfect because it had been committed in a simpler time, before DNA databases and digital surveillance and the forensic tools that would later make so many cold cases solvable. Then, in April 2003, Martinez got a phone call that changed everything. The caller was Thomas Riley's younger brother, Mark. Mark Riley was 45 years old, living in Chicago, where he worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm. He and his brother hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since a bitter falling out over their mother's estate after she died. The relationship between the brothers had never been close, different personalities, different paths in life, but the inheritance dispute had severed what little connection remained. The call to Martinez was brief, tense, and devastating. "I need to tell you something about Tom," Mark said, his voice tight. "About that girl who died. Michelle Hartley." Martinez's hand tightened on the phone. "I'm listening." In 1978, maybe early 1979, I can't remember exactly when, Tom and I got drunk together. We were at my apartment in Iowa City. I was in graduate school. Tom came to visit, and we went through a couple bottles of whiskey. He'd had a lot to drink, more than usual. More than I'd ever seen him drink, actually. And he started talking about Michelle Hartley. What did he say? Mark's voice was quiet, as if speaking the words too loudly would make them more real. He said he'd messed up. That he'd tried to help her, tried to be there for her because she was smart and he thought she had potential. But she'd misunderstood his intentions, thought it was romantic or something. And when they met that Saturday, she'd gotten upset when he tried to clarify that it was just mentorship. She'd threatened to tell her parents that he'd led her on, that he'd been inappropriate with her. Said she'd ruin his career before it even started. And then what? He said things got physical. She was crying, yelling at him. He tried to calm her down, but she kept threatening him, saying she'd tell everyone he tried to take advantage of her. He grabbed her to make her stop, and she fought back. Started scratching at him, hitting him. And then, he said it all happened so fast. 1 minute she was screaming at him, and the next she was on the ground, not breathing. He said he didn't mean to. Said his hands were just around her neck and then she stopped moving. Martinez felt her heart racing. Did he say where this happened? No. He didn't give details. Didn't say where they'd met or what he did afterward. Just that it had happened, that it was an accident, that he'd never meant to hurt her. And the next day, when I brought it up because I was freaking out about what he'd told me, he denied saying any of it. Got really angry. Said I'd misunderstood, that he'd been talking about a movie or a book he'd read. Told me to forget about it, to never mention it again. Why didn't you go to the police then? There was a long pause. Because he was my brother. And I was 22 years old, and I didn't want to believe he'd actually done it. I convinced myself I had misunderstood, that the alcohol had confused both of us, that maybe he really had been talking about something else. And then time passed, and it became easier to just not think about it. To pretend that conversation never happened. So why are you calling now? After all these years? Because I saw the news about you questioning him again. And I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I'm older now. I have kids of my own. And I keep thinking about that girl's parents, about them never knowing what happened to their daughter. And I realized that protecting my brother all these years, it made me complicit. I can't carry that anymore. The statement was problematic as legal evidence. It was hearsay. Mark hadn't witnessed the crime, just heard his brother's alleged confession while both were intoxicated. A defense attorney would tear it apart, argue it was unreliable, motivated by the family feud, impossible to verify after 25 years. But combined with everything else, the diary, the witness citing, the lies, the pattern of inappropriate behavior with students, the sudden departure from teaching, it might be enough. Prosecutor Chen reviewed the new information and made his decision. They would arrest Thomas Riley on suspicion of murder. The evidence was still largely circumstantial, but they had enough to put before a grand jury, and if indicted, enough to take to trial. On the morning of May 3, 2003, two police cars pulled up outside Thomas Riley's condo on the north side of Cedar Falls. Martinez was there, along with two uniformed officers and Prosecutor Chen. When Riley answered the door, he'd clearly been getting ready for work, wearing dress pants and a half-buttoned shirt. Martinez read him his rights and placed him under arrest for the murder of Michelle Hartley. He didn't resist. Didn't protest his innocence loudly. He just nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this moment for 26 years, and extended his hands for the handcuffs. The arrest sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls. Thomas Riley, the real estate agent who'd lived among them for decades, who coached youth baseball, who attended Rotary Club meetings, who seemed like such a normal, upstanding citizen. The whispers started immediately, spreading through grocery stores and coffee shops and church parking lots. Had anyone seen the signs? Should someone have known? How had he lived among them all these years, carrying that secret, pretending to be one of them? Mrs. Hartley got the call from Martinez at 8 in the morning. She'd been awake since 6, as she always was, going through the motions of her day. When the phone rang and Martinez said, "We've made an arrest in Michelle's case," Mrs. Hartley's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the kitchen floor and wept. If you believe people like Thomas Riley should be held accountable for what they've done, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like Michelle's, where the truth stays buried for decades, only surface when investigators refuse to give up and communities refuse to forget. That kind of persistence matters. That kind of memory matters. And the only way these victims get their justice, however long it takes, is if people like you stay engaged, stay informed, and refuse to let these stories disappear into the past. Because Michelle Hartley deserved better than to be forgotten. And so do all the others whose cases still sit in filing cabinets, waiting for someone to look at them one more time with fresh eyes. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the passage of time. Riley's attorney, a sharp defense lawyer from Des Moines named Richard Caldwell, argued that his client couldn't receive a fair trial 26 years after the alleged crime. Memories had faded, evidence had degraded, witnesses had died or moved away or couldn't be certain about what they'd seen a quarter-century ago. The diary could be interpreted multiple ways: a student's admiration for a teacher, nothing more. Carol Jennings's sighting was questionable after so many years. Mark Riley's recollection of a drunken conversation from 1978 was unreliable hearsay, possibly motivated by a family dispute over money. The pattern of inappropriate attention to students was vague, never formally documented, and didn't prove murder. But the prosecution had one advantage: Thomas Riley himself. The lies he'd told in the original investigation couldn't be explained away easily. His insistence that he barely knew Michelle, when the diary documented multiple meaningful interactions. His failure to mention their planned meeting on the day she disappeared. His claim that he'd never seen her outside of school, when at least one witness had seen them together that very morning. The trial began in October 2003, 26 years to the month after Michelle's death. Mrs. Hartley attended every day, sitting in the front row of the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving Riley. She was 73 years old now, her hair completely white, her face carved with grief that had aged her beyond her years. Her husband had died 2 years earlier of complications from his stroke, never knowing who killed their daughter. Danny flew in from Denver for the trial, taking time off from his job and away from his own family to be there for his mother. The prosecution presented their case methodically over 2 weeks. They called Carol Jennings, who testified that she'd seen Riley and Michelle together downtown on October 15, 1977. Despite aggressive cross-examination, she held firm to her account, describing what she'd seen with quiet certainty. They introduced Michelle's diary, with its entries about running into Riley at the library, about him saying she was smart, about planning to meet him that Saturday. The prosecution's expert testified about grooming behavior, about how predators often build relationships with victims through compliments and special attention, creating trust and dependency before crossing lines. They called the former principal, now elderly and frail, who testified about the vague concerns regarding Riley's behavior with female students that had been serious enough to note but not serious enough to formally document, a failure he seemed to regret, sitting in the witness box. They called Patricia Brennan and Jennifer Marks, the former students who described Riley's attention making them uncomfortable, establishing a pattern of behavior. And they called Mark Riley, who recounted his brother's alleged confession during that drunken conversation in 1978 or early 1979. His testimony was emotional, difficult. He cried on the stand, talking about the weight of carrying that secret for 25 years, the relief and guilt of finally speaking the truth. The defense attacked every piece of evidence systematically. Carol Jennings was mistaken. It had been 26 years, she'd only seen them for a few seconds from across a street, she couldn't be certain about the date or the identification. Human memory, the defense expert testified, is notoriously unreliable, especially over such long time spans. The diary proved nothing except that Michelle had developed a crush on a teacher and had misinterpreted his professional kindness as personal interest. Teenage girls do this all the time. It's sad, but it's not evidence of any actual relationship or inappropriate behavior on the teacher's part. The principal's concerns had been so minor they'd never been formally documented, never resulted in any disciplinary action. They were the kind of vague worries that arise in any school setting and usually amount to nothing. The former students' testimonies were irrelevant, even if true, being overly friendly or complimentary wasn't a crime and didn't prove murder. And Mark Riley's testimony was unreliable hearsay from a quarter-century ago. A drunken conversation that Mark himself admitted he wasn't sure he'd understood correctly at the time. A conversation that took place during a period when Mark was under academic stress, drinking heavily, possibly dealing with his own mental health issues. And conveniently, Mark and Thomas had recently had a bitter dispute over their mother's estate, giving Mark financial and emotional motives to lie or misremember. Most importantly, the defense argued, there was no physical evidence linking Thomas Riley to the crime scene. No DNA. No fingerprints that could be definitively matched to him. No forensic proof that he'd ever been alone with Michelle in that shed where her body was found. And Thomas Riley himself took the stand in his own defense. He admitted, in a calm, measured voice, that he'd had more contact with Michelle than he'd initially told police. He explained that he'd been young, scared, worried about being misunderstood when a student he'd taught had been murdered. He'd minimized the relationship out of fear of being suspected, fear of having his career ruined by association with a murdered girl. It had been stupid, he acknowledged. Dishonest. But it had been self-preservation, not guilt. Yes, he said, Michelle had expressed interest in talking about college. But they'd never actually met that Saturday. He'd been home alone, and he had no way to prove it all these years later, but that was the truth. Whatever Michelle had written in her diary about plans to meet him, those plans had been one-sided, her wishful thinking rather than any actual arrangement between them. He'd helped her find books at the library a couple of times. He'd encouraged her academically. That's what teachers do. They encourage students who show potential. There was nothing inappropriate about it. And the conversation Mark claimed to remember? Either Mark had misunderstood what Thomas said during a drunken night, or Mark was lying outright, motivated by their recent family conflict. Thomas denied ever making any such confession. He testified for nearly 6 hours, and he was calm throughout. Reasonable. Sympathetic, even. He acknowledged his mistakes, the lies to police, the fear-driven dishonesty, while firmly denying any involvement in Michelle's death. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict, guilty of murder in the second degree. The courtroom erupted. Mrs. Hartley collapsed into sobs, her whole body shaking with relief and grief and exhaustion. Danny put his arm around his mother and wept quietly, his face pressed against her white hair. On the other side of the courtroom, Thomas Riley sat motionless, his face blank, as if his mind had gone somewhere else entirely. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Riley turned and looked directly at Mrs. Hartley. For just a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. She would say later that she saw something there, not remorse exactly, but acknowledgement. A silent admission that all the years of pretending, all the layers of lies, were finally over. Detective Martinez watched from the back of the courtroom, feeling something she hadn't felt in 26 years of working this case, satisfaction. Not happiness. You couldn't be happy about any of this, about the decades lost, the justice delayed, the family that would never truly heal. But satisfaction that the work had mattered, that persistence had paid off, that Michelle Hartley's death hadn't been forgotten. The story of Michelle Hartley's murder raises questions that extend far beyond the specifics of one case in one small Iowa town. It asks us to consider how many other Thomas Rylas there are, living ordinary lives in ordinary communities, their secrets buried beneath years of normalcy and careful presentation. It asks us to think about the cost of silence, the danger of wanting to believe the best about people, the way institutions protect themselves by handling uncomfortable problems, quietly, rather than confronting them directly. It asks us to remember that predators often don't look like monsters. They look like substitute teachers who help students with their homework, who offer encouragement and guidance. Like real estate agents who coach youth baseball and attend community events. Like neighbors who wave from their lawns and seem like pillars of the community. And it reminds us that victims like Michelle Hartley, ordinary, quiet, 16 years old with her whole life ahead of her, deserve justice even when it takes decades to arrive. Deserve to be remembered not just as the girl who died, but as the girl who lived. Who wore white sneakers with blue stripes that she'd saved up 3 paychecks to buy. Who sang in the church choir even though her voice wasn't particularly strong. Who wanted to take AP English and go to college and maybe become a teacher. Who trusted the wrong person and paid with her life. The green sweater her grandmother sent for her birthday was buried with her. The yellow wallpaper in her bedroom stayed up until Mrs. Hartley died in 2009 at the age of 79, at which point Danny finally sold the house and boxed up Michelle's things. He kept the diary, the evidence that had helped convict her killer, in a safe in his home in Denver. The oak tree planted in Michelle's memory still stands on the grounds of Cedar Falls High School, now over 30 feet tall, though most students who pass it don't know its significance. Thomas Riley is serving his sentence at Iowa State Penitentiary. He's maintained his innocence in the years since his conviction, though he stopped giving interviews to reporters after 2005. His sons, now adults, haven't visited him since the trial. His name was quietly removed from the Rotary Club roster and the youth baseball coaching list. To the current residents of Cedar Falls, he's a cautionary tale, a reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight. The grain facility where Michelle's body was found is long gone, demolished in 1992 and replaced by a small industrial park where people go to work every day, unaware of what happened there more than 4 decades ago. The Dairy Queen where she scooped ice cream for minimum wage closed in 1989 and has been through several incarnations since. The library where she ran into Thomas Riley has been renovated twice, modernized, made unrecognizable from what it was in 1977. Cedar Falls has moved on, the way communities do. The population has grown. The University of Northern Iowa has expanded. New businesses have opened, old ones have closed. The murder of Michelle Hartley in 1977 has faded into local history, remembered by fewer people each year as those who lived through it age and die. But there are still people who remember. Who make sure Michelle's story doesn't disappear into the past. Who understand that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, that truth matters even when it takes decades to emerge. Detective Susan Martinez retired in 2006, 3 years after Riley's conviction. When asked about the case that defined her career, she always says the same thing: Michelle deserved someone who wouldn't give up. That's all I did. I didn't give up. And neither did her mother, who called every month for 26 years. That's the real persistence that solved this case. Mrs. Hartley lived long enough to see her daughter's killer convicted. She attended every day of the trial, heard every piece of evidence, watched as the jury delivered their verdict. She died peacefully, Danny said, in a way she probably hadn't been able to before the trial. She knew the truth. She knew Michelle's death hadn't been meaningless, hadn't been forgotten. She knew that the person responsible was being held accountable. And maybe that's what justice means when it comes 26 years too late. Not that it erases the loss or heals the wound. Not that it brings back what was taken. But that it refuses to let the lie stand. That it insists on truth even when truth is painful, even when it takes decades to emerge. That it says, you mattered. Your life mattered. And the person who took it will be held accountable, no matter how long it takes. The truth about October 15, 1977 will never be fully known. Thomas Riley has never provided details about what happened in those hours between when Michelle left her house and when her body was found in that shed. The exact location where she died, the precise sequence of events, the words exchanged between them, those are secrets he's kept, and likely will keep until he dies. But the broader truth emerged anyway. That a 24-year-old man in a position of authority crossed boundaries with a 16-year-old student. That he paid her special attention, made her feel seen and valued in ways that blurred appropriate lines. That he arranged to meet her in secret, or at minimum failed to discourage her from believing they had plans. That she ended up dead on the day they were supposed to meet. And that he spent the next 26 years living a normal life while Michelle's family lived with an absence that could never be filled, a grief that never fully healed. The case changed how Cedar Falls thought about the adults entrusted with their children. The school district, in the wake of the trial, implemented stricter policies about teacher-student interactions. Communication between staff and students was required to be transparent, documented when it occurred outside normal classroom settings. The whisper network that had allowed concerns about Riley to be handled quietly, without formal documentation, was replaced by mandatory reporting structures. Teachers were trained to recognize and report boundary violations. But policies can't protect against every threat. Can't eliminate every predator. Can't guarantee that people in positions of trust won't abuse that trust. What protects communities is vigilance. Memory. The willingness to ask hard questions and not accept easy answers. The refusal to let uncomfortable truths be buried because confronting them is difficult. Detective Martinez's investigation succeeded because she kept asking questions no one else was asking anymore. Because she looked at 25-year-old evidence with fresh eyes. Because she refused to accept that some cases were just meant to stay cold, that some victims would never get justice. But it also succeeded because of Carol Jennings, who'd made a statement in 1977 about seeing Michelle with a substitute teacher and remembered what she'd seen 25 years later when Martinez tracked her down. Because of Michelle's diary, preserved by a mother who couldn't let go of her daughter's things, who kept that bedroom unchanged for 3 decades. Because of a retired principal who held on to the memory of vague concerns about a young teacher's behavior. Because of Mark Riley, who finally found the courage to speak up about a drunken confession from 1978, despite the cost to his family relationships. Justice in this case wasn't the work of one person. It was the accumulation of small acts of honesty, of memory, of courage, coming together after decades to form something solid enough to stand on. And it was the work of Michelle herself, in a way. The diary she'd kept, not knowing it would someday become the evidence that convicted her killer. The truth she'd written down about planning to meet Mr. Riley, about his attention and encouragement. The record she'd left of their interactions. Those words outlasted the lie. Outlasted the silence. Became the foundation on which her justice was built. There's something profound in that. The idea that truth has its own persistence, its own gravity. That lies require constant maintenance, someone actively maintaining them, protecting them, shoring them up against exposure. But truth just sits there, patient, waiting for someone to look at it the right way. Thomas Riley spent 26 years maintaining his lie. Telling people he barely knew Michelle. Downplaying their interactions. Living his life as if October 15, 1977 had been just another Saturday. And the truth sat in case files and witness statements and diary entries, waiting for someone to assemble the pieces that had been there all along. When that finally happened, when Detective Martinez connected the dots that Pruitt had missed or dismissed, the lie couldn't hold. Not against the weight of evidence, the pattern of behavior, the testimony of people who'd carried small pieces of the truth for decades. Not against the simple fact that Michelle had written down what was happening to her before she died, and that truth had survived. There are lessons in this case, though calling them lessons feels inadequate given what they cost to learn. About the danger of institutional silence. About the way predators operate, building trust, isolating victims, exploiting power imbalances. About the importance of listening when young people try to tell us something's wrong, even if they don't have the words to explain it clearly, even if they don't fully understand what's happening to them. Michelle Hartley didn't tell anyone she felt uncomfortable with Thomas Riley's attention. Maybe she didn't realize she should feel uncomfortable. Maybe she thought it was normal for a teacher to take such personal interest in her future. Maybe she felt flattered, special, seen in a way that her peers and parents didn't see her. That's how grooming works. It doesn't feel wrong at first. It feels like kindness, like attention, like someone finally recognizing how special you are. By the time the victim might recognize the situation for what it is, they're already entangled in it, already keeping secrets, already isolated from the people who might protect them. By the time Michelle might have recognized that meeting Thomas Riley alone was inappropriate, she was already lying to her mother about where she was going. She was already in over her head in ways she couldn't articulate or escape. And when things went wrong that Saturday morning, whatever exactly happened in those moments before she died, she was alone with a man who'd carefully positioned himself as her mentor, her supporter, someone who believed in her. A man who'd created a situation where she had no one to call for help. The school district's new policies try to prevent that isolation. Try to ensure that adults working with children are never operating in the shadows, that interactions are transparent and documented. But policies only work if people follow them, if administrators enforce them, if communities demand accountability rather than quiet resolutions when concerns arise. The trial revealed that concerns about Riley had been raised informally in 1978, but nothing had been formally documented. He'd been allowed to leave teaching without any record of why, free to pursue other careers, free to interact with young people in other contexts. The failure wasn't malicious, it was institutional inertia, the desire to avoid conflict, the hope that the problem would just go away if the person left. But problems like Thomas Riley don't go away. They just go somewhere else. In the years after the trial, 2 other women came forward with stories about Riley that they'd never told anyone before. One had been his student in 1976, when she was 15. She said he'd offered to tutor her after school in his classroom, and during one of those sessions, he'd touched her arm in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, had stood too close, had said things about her appearance that felt wrong. She'd stopped going to the tutoring sessions and never told anyone why. The other woman had worked with him at a real estate office in the mid-1980s. She said he'd made repeated unwanted advances, and when she'd firmly rejected him, he'd made her work environment so hostile, subtle digs, undermining her with clients, spreading rumors, that she'd eventually quit. Neither woman had known about Michelle Hartley when these things happened to them. Neither had connected Riley's behavior toward them with a murder that had occurred years before or after their encounters. But when they heard about his conviction, when they saw his face on the news, something clicked. They recognized the pattern of behavior, the way he targeted women who were younger or in subordinate positions, the way he used charm and manipulation to get what he wanted, the way he turned hostile when rejected. Their stories were never prosecuted, too much time had passed, evidence was non-existent, and Riley was already serving life in prison. But they added context. Confirmed that Michelle's murder wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the most extreme outcome of a pattern that had likely been present throughout Riley's adult life. And they raised the haunting question, how many others were there? How many women had encountered Thomas Riley and come away with a story they were too afraid or ashamed or confused to tell? That question will probably never be fully answered. But it matters that it was asked. That the conviction for Michelle's murder created space for other truths to emerge. That the silence was broken not just about one crime, but about a pattern of behavior that had harmed multiple people across multiple decades. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. Mrs. Hartley didn't live to hear those other women's stories. They came forward in 2004 and 2005, after her death. But Danny did. He said it helped, in a strange way. Not because it made Michelle's death make more sense, but because it confirmed that his sister hadn't been special in some terrible way. Hadn't done anything to deserve what happened. Hadn't somehow brought this on herself through naivety or poor judgment. She'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person, a person who demonstrated repeatedly that he didn't respect boundaries, didn't see women as fully human, didn't believe rules applied to him. The question of whether Michelle could have been saved, if someone had reported Riley's behavior earlier, if the school had formally documented the concerns, if the system had worked the way it was supposed to, is painful and probably unanswerable. The institutional failures that allowed Riley to operate without real scrutiny were real, but they weren't unique to Cedar Falls or to 1977. They were endemic to a time and culture that preferred to handle uncomfortable situations quietly rather than confront them directly, that valued institutional reputation over individual safety. That culture has shifted, somewhat. Teachers are more carefully vetted. Boundaries are more clearly defined. Reporting structures are more robust. But the fundamental challenge remains. Predators are often skilled at presenting themselves as trustworthy, at exploiting the gaps between policy and practice, at identifying victims who won't be believed or won't speak up. The best defense isn't just better policies. It's vigilance. Willingness to ask hard questions. Refusal to accept that someone being charming or professional means they can't also be dangerous. And it's the understanding that when someone does come forward with concerns or allegations, the worst possible response is to make it go away quietly. Because making it go away doesn't protect anyone. It just protects the predator. Michelle Hartley's case reminds us that justice can arrive decades late, but it also reminds us that the better path is preventing the crime in the first place. That protecting children requires more than policies and procedures. It requires adults willing to see what's happening and act on it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient, even when it might reflect poorly on an institution they care about. The memorial oak tree on the Cedar Falls High School campus has grown tall and full in the decades since it was planted. Students sit under it during lunch, study beneath its shade, carve initials into its bark, unaware of its significance. But sometimes, on October 15th, someone who remembers will tie a green ribbon around its trunk, the color of the sweater Michelle was wearing when she died. It's a small gesture. A quiet one. But it serves as a reminder that she was here, that she mattered, that her story didn't end with her death. The truth is that most victims of violent crime don't get justice. Most cold cases stay cold. Most families live with unanswered questions for the rest of their lives, carrying grief that never fully resolves. Michelle Hartley's case is the exception, not the rule. But exceptions matter. They prove that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. They demonstrate that persistence, evidence, and courage can overcome time and silence. They show that the truth, however deeply buried, however carefully concealed, has the power to emerge if people are willing to keep looking for it. The final truth about Michelle Hartley's murder is this: a 16-year-old girl left her house one Saturday morning in October of 1977, and she never came home. For 26 years, the person responsible lived free while her family lived with unresolvable grief. But in the end, the truth caught up. The lie collapsed. Justice, however delayed, arrived. Michelle's mother held on to hope for 26 years, calling the police department every month, keeping her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been, refusing to let the case be forgotten. That hope was rewarded, though it came too late to undo the damage, to bring Michelle back, to restore what was lost. But it mattered anyway. Because truth matters. Because accountability matters. Because the message sent by Thomas Riley's conviction was clear: you cannot take a life and simply move on. You cannot hide behind normalcy and charm and the passage of time. Eventually, if enough people care enough to keep looking, the truth will find you. That's what stories like this teach us. Not that the justice system is perfect. It isn't. Not that good always triumphs, it doesn't. But that persistence matters. That memory matters. That refusing to forget is itself a form of resistance against the forces that would prefer silence to truth, that would prefer comfort to accountability. Michelle Hartley was 16 years old when she died. She would have been 63 now, if Thomas Riley hadn't wrapped his hands around her neck that Saturday morning in 1977. She might have gone to college, pursued English like Mr. Riley suggested, though the suggestion was poisoned by his true intentions. She might have gotten married, had children of her own, built a life that extended far beyond the borders of Cedar Falls, Iowa. She might have been anything. Instead, she's a memorial tree, a cold case solved, a name in court records, a reminder that the ordinary can become extraordinary in the worst possible way. But she's also proof that truth outlasts lies. That justice, however slow and imperfect, can still arrive. That the people who love us don't give up, even when years turn to decades and hope becomes harder to hold on to. And maybe, in the end, that's what we owe to victims like Michelle. Not just the investigation, the trial, the conviction, but the refusal to forget. The insistence that their lives mattered, that their stories deserve to be told, that the truth deserves to be known no matter how long it takes to emerge from the silence. Because Michelle Hartley mattered. And the fact that it took 26 years to prove it, to hold someone accountable for taking her life, doesn't diminish that truth. It just makes it more precious. More hard-won. More necessary to remember. I'll see you in the next one.